unmuting. It's a cognitive task for everybody, even after 9 months.
It also fills the airspace.
All right, we're recording on both ends.
Thank you, Roland.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so this is part 2 of the Ad Hoc Special Education Committee. It is December 15th at 5:40 p.m. And Yvette, if you want to move to sharing.
Thank you, Erica. I'm going to see if this works. Can you see the PowerPoint? Excellent. Okay. I just need to. Okay. So we want to share with you some of the highlights in planning, both for next year and moving forward, as well as in the very immediate in terms of responses with regard to our COVID impact interventions. So the first is I want to give you a high level of budget considerations for planning purposes. Erica had asked, how will the urban collaboratives work impact budget planning? And certainly there will be input in February and we can add or change, but for considerations with regard to compliance needs or program support, we needed to put some projections in so that the district could look at the budgetary implications of our needs. So this is a very, very high level. I want to let the committee know that we believe that we've done very extensive program development over the past 3 years. And at this point, we have a pretty full continuum of services. So we are not, as a department, recommending major new program development. Rather, what we are recommending is implementation with fidelity of that which we've developed and monitoring the program efficacy and, of course, the student achievement. In addition, as we look at, excuse me, caseload needs, we're seeing a larger number of kids leaving elementary school than are going into high school. So we are projecting for caseload management and compliance, we are projecting additional positions will be needed at the middle school. In addition, and then finally, as kids come into program, we're planning on looping up so that we can continue the students that are participating successfully in program and have space for new children as they are identified. And that is specifically in the NEST program, and Stacy will talk about grade levels and where our clusters of kids are. The co-teaching model that we began in kindergarten 2 years ago, those kids are now aging up, and we want to continue to support that least restrictive model. Issues to support the intensive literacy work that we're doing both in the transition program that was presented to Ad-Hoc last year when we were still in person, as well as the work being done at the Literacy Center. And then finally, an additional teacher is needed for next steps as additional students are aging into that program, and also in recognition that we now are serving kids through 22 instead of 21. So we were able to absorb this year, but we won't next year without another position. So let me turn it over to Stacy just to talk about grade levels around the nest and talk a little bit more about what's happening at the Literacy Center and the transition programs.
Thank you, Yvette. So currently for NEST, we have at the elementary level, a 1st and a 3rd grade, and at the middle school, we have a 6th and 7th grade. Our goal at the elementary will be to eventually have a K-5. So we look at every year kind of expanding the program. So we're looking at adding another elementary class for our third going into fourth grade, so that we are continuing that. And eventually, as I said, we'd like to have the K through 5 continuum. So it's in addition of each year as those clusters move up. At the middle school, it would be adding an 8th grade. We currently have a 6th grade, a 7th grade, and those 7th graders will be 8th graders next year. So we'll have an entire 6 through 8. So the goal then being looking at K through 8 and then possibly even K through 12, looking at, are we going to support those middle school students as they move into high school? The program's provided a lot of success for students, and helping them transition into the general education classroom successfully, and especially into the middle school. We've seen a lot of success there as well. For the co-teaching, we're looking at adding an additional to Kendall and Brookside. At Brookside, we currently have a K1-2, so we would be looking at adding a 3rd grade. And at Kendall, we have a K1, so we'd be looking at adding a 2nd grade. So as those students loop up, we're expanding that so that, the 2nd graders have a 3rd grade to move into, and then we have a new group that comes up into the kindergarten as we keep going.
So these are very preliminary projections, but we felt we needed to put them out there for budget planning purposes. Obviously, if we don't have a cluster in a particular place, we won't proceed, but we're anticipating that will be the movement to continue to support the students as they move through the grades. In addition, we're asking for continuation of support for our bilingual staff. We just hired a bilingual speech language pathologist. We'll be starting in January. So we're continuing to seek to support those positions that were previously added into the budget at the end of the year when we had that very large increase in our welcoming our newly immigrated students, and that needs to be continued into next year's budget. There is a request as a superintendent's priority to support through pupil services attendance facilitators. Later on this evening, we'll be having a discussion about attendance at the board meeting and engagement. And these positions would be to move into the community, to do home visits, to really work very intensively with those students that are disengaged or chronic truancy in a preventative way, without needing to make referrals to DCF and really working very hard to move the kids back into school and remove the barriers that are getting in the way. There's also a superintendent's priority for collaborative support for SRBI, with the goal of supporting not necessarily through pupil services or specialized learning solely, but really through collaboration to have reading and math specialists in all the schools, as well as an SRBI coordinator in the district. And I think that will begin to address some of the longstanding concerns that this committee has heard about child find and interventions prior to referral, so that we're not looking at kids in the 4th grade or the 6th grade or the 8th grade that needed interventions, didn't receive them, and then we're working to catch up instead of intervening early.
Can I ask a clarifying question?
Yes.
So I knew about the math and reading specialists, which I support. Would they then advance a student to a PPT at a certain, it's usually 6 or 8 weeks is what the manual says, in terms of then having them be evaluated. I hope that these people will be there not just to support them, but also to help with this identification process.
So obviously,
There is a real problem.
the goal of SRBI is to intervene early so that those kids that need intervention receive it and they respond to that intervention. And it's very intensive. Typically, a protocol would last 4 to 6 weeks. There could be multiple protocols put in place. So if the student isn't responding to a particular protocol, you may want to keep that intensity and try another protocol for 4 to 6 weeks. So it could be 12 weeks, but it is data driven, it is progress monitoring driven. And if we don't see a student responding to close that gap, then the school would make the referral. It wouldn't necessarily be from the interventionist, but it would go back to the data team. And the data team would look at it and say, I suspect a disability, I need to refer. And that has not happened a lot in Norwalk. The referrals really, in my anecdotal view, come more from parents
Mhm.
than they do from staff, because I think we've been missing this step. So once we have this step in place, I think the gaps, kids will respond and not need to be referred later on, or the school will have the documentation they need to say, we've tried with fidelity, and the data is showing that the student's not responding and perhaps there's a suspected disability.
Okay, so the longest any student should be in SRBI without moving to an evaluation would be 12 weeks.
I don't want to,
in a perfect world.
well, if a student is not responding, there are kids that do respond, but the gap doesn't close immediately. So the team may come together at week 6 and again at week 12 and say, we really see progress. We don't want to change what we're doing. We may need to continue for another X weeks. I don't suspect a disability, but something else is in the way that we're going to address. So a kid may not be referred, but it won't be languishing for a year or years. You should expect to see it, and the parent should have that input. But again, it's a priority for us, both on the IEP side and not on the IEP side. We want those gaps to close, and we don't want special education to be responsible for that which should be remediated through SRBI, so that we can really focus on resources. In addition, we're asking for increased supports in related services. Again, Stacy will talk about specifically, but monitoring caseloads. We're looking at the speech and language. We have a plan for staffing the OT and PT, as well as supervision. So Stacy, if you want to just talk a little more specifically there.
Okay. So in the last few years, our related service department has really grown. Specifically with OT and PT, we've moved from outside contractors to our own staff. So we have 11 OTs and CODAs that are now a full department, whereas opposed to those were all contracted positions as of 2 years ago. So we've been growing that slowly. We also have one of our own PTs, and we're looking at increasing that for next year. So there's a lot to be said about having our own staff we're supervising. For speech and language, we've also grown that department as well too. In the last few years, we've added 7 new positions to our speech and language, and for speech and language therapists, and we've also added a number of SLPAs for support, both for the speech and language pathologists and in our transition classrooms. So we have 32 speech and language personnel that are in that department. So we've definitely grown, and also within that, with related services, we have three teachers of the hearing impaired that are working at the various levels, as well as we have our teacher of the visually impaired. We have a full-time adaptive PE teacher. So we have a number of related and itinerant service providers that are working around the district. And as Yvette said, we actually just added a full-time bilingual speech and language pathologist to the roster that'll start at the beginning of the year.
So we've made a major investment in our related service staff that brings us into compliance. Eric and I had earlier conversation about when someone leaves, how quickly can we restaff? So we have a robust department, and that robust department needs supervision. So we are looking at a supervisor of related services, specifically for the speech language, OT and PT service providers, as that department has grown. So we're now looking at close to 40 staff members, and they require supervision and support and clinical coaching. So that's the big picture of budget overview. As the weeks go by, I know that we'll be making final recommendations through the Budget and Finance Committee, but this is sort of the tall view, the 50,000 foot view, whatever that saying is, as to what the department is looking at in terms of needs for compliance purposes and caseload management, as well as to serve the more moderate to severely disabled kids in the programs that we've developed over the past 3 years. So I'll stop, and if there are questions, I'll listen and answer.
I have a quick question of that. Are there any assumptions or considerations as hopefully COVID quiets down and kids, we potentially have a full reentry next year, fingers crossed, that there may be additional staff needed to potentially support kids as they're, I'm just anticipating there might be more students identified as in need of support, potentially as a whole full integration happens again. And so just any budget assumptions as additional needs of new hires and things like that to include, or is that not?
So
I don't know. I'm just throwing it out there.
That's really where the SRBI comes in.
Got it.
The
Okay.
academic piece.
Okay.
We know our kids are going to need remediation,
Yep.
whether it's through SRBI or through gen ed interventions or through after school programs or, and increased summer school support. We know that our kids are going to need that support throughout. This year with the COVID impact money, we did hire 5 additional social emotional support personnel, 2 social workers, 3 school counselors. 2 of those 5 are bilingual staff members. So, we're anticipating that is already here. We'll be working with the principals around school-based budgeting. Should that be needed, how do they support those additional positions through the SBBs? Of course, right now that's where the school counselors are budgeted to.
Thank you, Yvette.
Sure.
Hi, it's Eric. I just have a quick question.
Yes.
Hello? Oh, okay. Sorry, I couldn't tell. I know it's about 1.5 years away, but when are we going to start planning on the transition from NEST or any succeeding program for the high school on the 9th grade level?
Great question, Eric. So the nest is following the cohort of kids. And over time, additional students have been identified. We recognize it's not a program for every student, and its criteria is very specific. But at this point, we're serving, I just looked at the numbers, we're serving the sweet spot that we had originally identified, 4 to 6 kids per nest grade. So as you probably know, the first middle school kids are now entering the 8th grade, right? So we will be looking this year in 2021, 21, 22, we will be looking at that cohort in the 8th grade, making determinations if they will still need that level of service. And we will then be doing service delivery planning with our high schools to support that cohort. And that would appear in the 22-23 budget. Am I years correct? Yes. So,
okay. So it sounds like probably in the fall of next year.
yeah, as just as I'm sitting here with you now talking about 21, 22, we'll be sitting here in November, December, making projections for 22, initial projections for 22, 23, all subject to final discussions and appropriations and going before the BET and I mean, the budget process. We'll make
Right.
our projections. And again, what I'm sharing with you tonight is conceptual more than specific. This is what we're looking at as the need. We will continue to vet those numbers, and if something changes and I need to come back and say, something else is needed in the elementary or the high school, because groups have changed or referral patterns have changed or kids have moved in or kids have moved out, or we've identified some kids out of district and we're working with families to build program for return. I mean, all of those are variables that we build into program design, and would come back and make modifications and budget requests as needed.
Great. Thank you.
You're welcome. Should I go on, Erica, to the next topic? Okay. So I wanted to bring this group up to date on the status of the Urban Collaborative Review. I want to thank you all, those of you that participated in those interviews. Thank you, Erica, for getting this group up and running. We have been continuously sending them data as requested, both on student demographic data, fiscal data, personnel data, the trends over the past 5 years, as well as achievement data. So, as they make the request, we've been sending it to them. The feedback is they are very appreciative of the robust data that we have available to them to provide to them. In addition, last week and 1 or 2 interviews the previous week, the Urban Collaborative met with 125 people, basically in 3 days. We put together individual interviews and focus groups, and those 125 interviews were completed last Friday. Went from everyone from board members, superintendent, Ad-Hoc, sped pack, 3 parent focus groups, lots and lots of staff groups, principals, curriculum and instruction, the cabinet, finance, personnel. I don't think there was really a stakeholders group that they didn't speak to except for our students, and I've asked get a timing for them to talk to students as well. So the interviews and the focus groups work has been completed. The next step is to work with our chief of communications to bring into queue the parent surveys. So while the Urban Collaborative met with 3 or 4 parent focus groups, they were really very targeted groups, either parents on Ad-Hoc or Sped Pack, and certainly we want voice from a wider community. So they are preparing those surveys, and we'll get them into queue so that we're not getting into survey fatigue in our community, and that we get the information we need robustly. And then the last piece that will be done is to schedule the classroom observations. We were hoping that that would be done in person, but given our timeline and given the peak in COVID, we will be very creative, as we have been, in getting classroom observations done remotely. I personally have been doing those observations, and it's fascinating to see what kids are experiencing when they are remote and participating, at a time when kids are in the classroom and participating. And our teachers really are to be commended for the lift that they are doing to make that hybrid synchronous learning work for the kids. And Urban Collaborative will have the opportunity to see the program fidelity of implementation, and also be able to see the creativity of our staff to make that work during COVID time. So that's the status. I anticipate having a preliminary report at the end of January so that it can move to the board's working meeting in February for a presentation, recommendations, in time to have budget impact and impact on the standard operating priorities, and then a follow-up more formal report that we've agreed would happen so that they could get into the timeline that would work for us for budget and SOP. So that's my brief report on that status. I don't know if anyone has questions.
Yvette, can you clarify on the remote classroom observations? Are they virtually observing in-person experiences, or is it a mix of them virtually observing in-person and virtual sessions?
They will observe what is the reality for our kids right now. So if they are going to see the younger success class at Tracy, we will set up that virtual, I don't want to call it virtual, that remote, the ability for them to observe remotely. They will observe what is in the classroom and what is on the screen, because at any point in time, that classroom may have 7 children in person and 2 children coming in remotely. So they will be able to observe that full experience. Stacy and I have had the experience of doing that with the State Department of Education for their recertification of the private school programs. And I think we learned a lot as to how to do that, and we're ready to set that up for Urban Collaborative. And we've also been on several national working groups that talk about best practices for observation, both for evaluation as well as non-evaluative observations during this hybrid synchronous moment in time. So it'll be interesting, but we'll be able to get make sure that they have a good observation protocol for them to do their work.
And can you speak to, for the benefit of the folks at home, how those classrooms are selected to ensure that we have a good random sample?
So what was requested for the observations specifically were the new program development that was created through the Special Ed Redevelopment Fund. That was the closeout of the CREC report. So they will be going into the success classrooms, the LEAP classrooms, the transition classrooms. They'll observe some work through the literacy clinic. They'll look at our co-teaching and our nest and so on. So those are the classrooms that have been identified for the preliminary observations. If they feel they need to look at a resource room or some other special class, we can arrange that as well.
And on the survey, they're crafting the survey questions and Brenda is just pushing it out, correct?
Yes, and she's helping us to establish where in the queue of surveys this should go. Okay. So then finally, what brings us really to the immediate, this is all wonderful planning for the future, and it gives us great joy to think about the future, but we can't forget that we are also in the middle of a national pandemic, and we need to plan for our kids. So the district is continuing to be committed to serving in person to the greatest extent possible and safe our most vulnerable kids. And for tonight, I'm going to talk specifically about our kids with disabilities, but know that the plan is extending to our multi-language learners as well. So the first step is we need to make sure that we're taking every precaution to mitigate against COVID, and that is to ensure that all of our mitigating strategies are in place and continue to be in place. Just yesterday, we distributed 40 trifold plexiglass desks to the high schools for some classrooms that are working in closer proximity to kids, and staff felt the need for that. So we're continuing to look at those mitigating factors to make sure that staff and kids are safe in this environment. All of the data that we have seems to support what is being reported nationally, that when schools are following protocols, the positive rate in schools is lower than the community exposure. And we believe that our schools continue to follow those protocols, and we're working to keep them safe. Having said that, all of you have access to the district's webpage that continually updates the number of staff members in quarantine. And when staff members are exposed outside, we may not need to put a class in quarantine because they haven't been exposed, but we have staff members who may have had may have been exposed that are now in quarantine or pending testing results and. And in those cases, it's because of our ability to staff the building that we've looked at closing buildings, not because of a particular exposure. We know that for our kids with moderate and severe disabilities, this is very difficult for them. Those are our kids that may not benefit from a remote 2-week hiatus. We are really hearing our parents, and we're looking at the progress monitoring of those kids. So our plan is, and this is very preliminary, this is in no way something that we are ready to roll out now. We are working on this. We'll be working on this for the next 2 weeks, and then we'll be able to pivot once we have the plans. but we are looking at reopening January 3rd. If schools are closed because of staffing, we are looking to see what the protocol would be to keep our students with disabilities, particularly our students with moderate to severe disabilities, and our most impacted multi-language learners in school, should a school move to full remote because of staffing. So clearly, we need to contact Trace to be sure that Anthony hasn't been exposed and Anthony's special education class students haven't been exposed. I'm just using you as an example, Anthony. So if there's no exposure there and that class is safe and we can staff that, we would put a priority on having those children and staff members and support staff working in the buildings as long as we can safely staff it. We will be working with the building principals during next week to finalize those plans. We are starting to pull the data on which kids we would be able to prioritize in this way. And that would be our kids, again, moderate to severe disabilities, our students attending special classes, or our kids with very intensive IEPs of 10 hours or more of special education services. So we're not saying only the kids in special ed classes would have this opportunity. What we're saying is we would base that priority on the intensity of the child's need. So if a kid has a very intensive one-on-one program that we can continue safely in school, we would do so. We are concerned, obviously, about the health and safety of all our kids. So again, I'm going to say contact tracing and being sure that it's a safe plan for that class or that group of students. Should staff go in, support staff or the primary teacher need to quarantine, we need to assess that we have appropriate subs to cover. Now, we wouldn't be covering a whole building, which became impossible. So in a building of 40, if 20 people are in quarantine, we don't have 20 subs. But if we're running 2 or 3 classes and one of those teachers needs to quarantine, we could find, one sub to cover this plan. We recognize that there is an impact on our students by constantly pivoting. So to go from in-person to remote and back again, each time we make that transition, particularly for our most intensive need kids, it becomes very difficult. We will offer continued parental preference. So as I look at, for example, we pulled the middle school just to see how many kids fit the criteria. So in one middle school, it is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It is 12 kids that would meet this criteria. One in a special class, and then a handful of other children in very intensive programs. So I'll be working with that middle school principal to say, what would be your plan if this is our priority and how do we move forward? We were concerned that if a special class or a group of kids were the only kids in the building, what would be the insult to least restrictive environment? But we said that in the balance of direct service delivery, safety, staffing safety, and access, in that Rubik's Cube of problem solving, we would provide the access to the mainstreaming through meaningful remote instruction, that the student would be in school, his mainstream class would be remote, his mainstream teacher would be working remotely, but his special ed service provider would be in person with him to facilitate that. So I see Kelly shaking her head that it's starting to make sense. Good. And then, of course, we're looking at safe, meaningful related service delivery. We have been delivering our related services overwhelmingly remotely, only because Emily courses so many classes and we really want to protect her and every cohort we really want to protect Emily and every cohort that she may cross. So we want to, we limited that crossing. In this model, if we were to do this model for 2 weeks, Emily could, if she were in that school, serve those kids directly and then serve the rest of her caseload remotely. And that would minimize her cohort crossing. So that is our very preliminary plan, subject to looking at numbers. We're running those numbers now. I will be formally presenting this to Cabinet to get support, and then working with the principals to nail down individual school plans so that they know how this would work and how this would roll out. So that is our immediate planning. We're very worried about that particular group of students and how we can serve them well. So I'll stop sharing, and if anyone has questions, if not, I'll turn it back to Madam Chair.
So Yvette, I know you and I have had this conversation in the past, but this is really critical for our families, and I'll just speak for my family. Routine is the foundation of how my daughter functions, and you know, I'm thrilled that you guys are exploring this, and thank you for that heavy lift.
Thank you, Erica. Thank you for your support.
I agree. I think if you haven't lived it, you can't understand what the disruption of the routine looks like, but it's really impactful. And, you know, what is it, 1,300 families going through that is a big deal for our whole community. And it's also an impact. There's a lot of research out about the impact of the pandemic on women in their careers. And often the women are staying home when the child has to be remote, and it's impacting their ability to be effectively employed. So I think it's very, very good that we are exploring this and prioritizing it, because it has obviously the primary impact on the outcome of these children's education, but also on the mental health of our whole community. So thank you.
Thank you. I see a little head, Anthony. It's making me smile. So that ends my report, Erica.
Okay, and with that, I believe I'm just pulling up the agenda. I think the only other thing on our agenda with the last 8 minutes is an update from Amy and the NSPED pack, if there is one.
Yes, so in our committee, we've broken up into 2 working groups. We have one that's focusing on communication, and they are diving into district-wide communication and how it affects parents and students and staff with regards to special education. The group is also looking at how communication affects all these areas and what advice can be given to the Board of Ed to strengthen these areas. The other working group is IEP compliance. That group is working. I'm actually on that committee, and I met with Stacy and Yvette today, so thank you so much. And they are sharing caseload and staff data with us, so we can take a deeper dive into that within that IEP compliance. And NCPAC was invited to be part of the Urban Collaborative, so thank you so much for including us. The whole committee, parents, staff were invited to do it. And we also have 2 student members now on our committee, so we're so excited. We've got 2 high schoolers, and we feel like we're really well represented between students, staff, and educators. And again, we're always looking for members to join. We would love to have a diverse group across the board to really represent our community and who we are. So again, thanks for all your support for NCPAC.
Okay, thank you, Amy. Does anybody else have anything else before we close? Okay, so Barbara, we'll just motion to adjourn here.
So moved.
Okay, all right. And with that, I will close out the meeting at 6:24 p.m. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a good night.
Very efficient. Have a good night, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Good night. Thank